Today, I will be reviewing Dancing with Bullets Under a Neon Sun, a very weird cyberpunk rules light RPG game, powered by the Black Hack. Let's jack in. Here is our book, Dancing with Bullets Under a Neon Sun. It's got a really nice shiny cover, I will admit that, and the inside or the pages on the outside are silver, and on the back we get a nice little powered by the Black Hack. And I got this through Exalted Funeral, by the way, about $25 there. But you can also get the PDF from Exalted Funeral or Drive Through RPG. When you open up this book, though, you are greeted by the inside cover pages. This is actually a map of the city that this supposedly takes place. And you see that there are numbers all the way around, because when you actually go to the first page, right here, you get the actual locations and a brief description of what those are. And on the back cover, you actually get the net, because this is a cyberpunk type role-playing game. It only makes sense that there's actually a location for what happens in the net. And it's actually really interesting that they include like actual places that you can go to within the net, as opposed to something whereas in Cyberpunk 20, or rather Cyberpunk Red, it's just like you access the net and now you're in sort of some architecture kind of deal. So you get a net key, which has more places that your players can go to for the net. The whole, map of the two locations, they're quite interesting. It reminds me of like those weird paintings that are kind of like, like the melted clock and sort of deal. It kind of reminds me of that a little bit. And so this book is separated into 9 different chapters. 38 of those pages are actually full of information for players and the admin, which is the GM of this setting. And the rest is random tables. So this book is about 65 pages, including the character sheet at the end of the book. So yeah, we'll get into that in a minute. This was written by Chance Phillips and Paul Gallagher, with artwork by Dirk Deitweiler Leichte. So very interesting. And we'll touch upon the art as we go through this. It's a very interesting style, let's just say that. It's very OSR. So yeah. So basically, the first chapter, as in any type of RPG book, is going to be an introduction. What is this game? This definitely gives you a very brief description of what this game is. It's a very weird cyberpunk type game. The second page is chapter 2. What is the core mechanic? And I really wish that they would have used a different color for these types of words, because the outside border of this page happens to be that same color. And it actually took me a lot more time than I care to mention to realize what this was actually saying. So the core mechanic of this game, based off of the Black Hack, is that you have your characteristics, which are might, agility, charm, intellect, perception, and tech. And the higher the score is, the better at that you're going to be. That's obvious. So instead, what you're going to do, if you're trying to make a check to do something, you roll a d20 straight up. There are no modifiers at all. And you're trying to roll underneath your characteristic score. So let's say if I have an agility of 17 and I'm trying to do something that uses that characteristic, I'd have to roll a 17 or lower. And characteristics can only go up to 19 in this game. So it gets rid of the need for bonuses and keeping track of stuff like that. So it's very interesting that they went that way, which is, the Black Hack way, I suppose. So making a character is very easy. You just roll 2D, or you roll a 2d8 for each of the characteristics, although if you get 15 or higher, your next roll is a 2d6 plus 1. So it makes sure that you're not going to have any super powerful, tough characters in a way. Then you're going to figure out your hit points, and you actually don't have hit points in this game per se. You actually use dice to keep track of your survivability, let's just say. Most characters are going to have a d8 to start with, And if you've seen my review on Sentinel Comics RPG, it works very similar to that. So let's say that I have let's say that my health is going to be a D8. Okay. If I take a hit, I basically roll my hit die on a 1 or a 2. I lower it down to the next level, which would be a D6. Anything above that, though, I get to keep that hit. So essentially, you could get one-shotted very easily with unlucky rolls. Then again, you could get very lucky. You have a health pool, a physical health pool, and then you have a mental health pool for things that take place in the net. So that's very interesting that they have those two different health pools together. And it makes sense given it's a cyberpunk type game. So after you determine all of that, you get to pick one of 6 different classes. You have contractors, mercs, freaks, puppets, sharks, and spiders. So contractors are like your law enforcement type deals. They're actually trained. Mercs are like your untrained professionals. Freaks are like the people that are really excel in the net. Puppets are like these robots, I guess. They don't need equipment to actually jack into the net. Sharks are like con artists, and spiders are like your thieves. So, a very brief overview of the different types of classes, and this is actually all you're going to get in terms of description, because everything else, it's just your starting resilience, your starting funds, and every class gets a special ability. So for example, for the contractor, if the contractor successfully attacks an enemy while bloodied, which means that specific enemy's hanging by a thread on a D4 die, then you roll that enemy's hit die twice, so they're more likely to actually down an NPC. You have different quirks, and you get a starting belonging by rolling on the handy-dandy rollable chart here. And so each of the different classes kind of follows that same function. They all do different things. They all excel at different things. And since there are no skills or anything like that, it's very bare bones. One of the problems that I had with this, specifically reading it, this is actually at the very beginning of the book, before you get a brief overview of the different mechanics of the game, other than rolling a d20 and rolling under your abilities. So, for example, the Mercs move their hit die up 1 step whenever they roll the highest possible result, okay? But must re-roll using their new hit die. If they roll the highest result on their new hit die, they do not increase the size of their hit die again. This cannot increase their hit die above its normal size. It is possible to increase your hit die a size and then instantly move it back down. That took me a very long time to figure out what they were talking about. And this specific ability is, or actually rather this mechanic, isn't mentioned until towards the end of this book. So what they're actually talking about is when you get hit, you roll your hit die, right? So if you roll the maximum, so let's say I roll this 8 on my D8, that means I get to go up to a D10, and then I can re-roll again. However, I cannot go above whatever my max hit die is. And it doesn't really do a great job explaining that in terms of the actual game mechanics. So, freaks, they can burn their characteristics while in the net to increase their skills while in the net, or whatever they're trying to do in the net, so they can do pretty cool things while they're actually jacked into the net. Puppets are like your robots. They don't need tech to jack in. That's kind of pretty much all there is for the puppets. And again, these classes, they're very bare bones. They don't really explain anything else about it. There's no actual lore in this book whatsoever. Sharks, I would equate them to being like your executive from Cyberpunk. They have a once per session ability. They can attempt to roll a D100 to roll equal to or below their charm score. So you're only going to have at most a 19% chance to actually accomplish that. And of course, if you do, you befriend that person that you're talking to. However, if you fail, which let's be honest, that's going to be about 81% of the time, things escalate. So yeah, how useful is that class? Not very, in my opinion. Spiders are like your thieves. So a spider can roll a charm check once per session to contact a dealer, a fence, or some other such underground resource. They can go ahead and call in a favor from that person, although all payments must be made. And if you go into debt with that person, they will eventually come to collect. So very interesting mechanic for that one, at least. They have the lowest starting resilience in the entire, between all of the classes. So then you get a nice handy dandy chapter on how to fight. So initiative in this game is actually really interesting. It really intrigued me. So everybody rolls an agility score. So remember, you're trying to roll underneath your agility score. If you succeed, you get to go first. You go to the top of the list. Enemies always go second. If you fail your agility score, you go after the enemies. So really there's only 3 rounds per turn, or rather 3 turns per round. People who pass their agility score, enemies, and people who do not pass. I think that's a really interesting way of doing initiative. It's very quick. It doesn't require you to actually keep track of, who's going next, because everything happens simultaneously in a round anyways. So that's actually really interesting. I would like to incorporate that in some other games as well, in some other systems. So armor increases your resilience, which is how you can basically prevent yourself from having to roll your hit die. So all armor has some sort of resilience. So whenever a player gets hit or is about to get hit, they roll an agility. And remember, if you roll underneath, then you are safe. You manage to dodge it. However, if not, then you roll your hit die unless you spend resilience points to counteract that. And once you're done with resilience points, you don't get those back until you take a long rest, essentially. So everything here is kind of player facing. And when we say player facing, that means all of the players are actually rolling for their stats or their checks, whether an enemy's trying to hit them or not. So if they're trying to hit an enemy, then they are rolling to hit or they're rolling to defend. So it's very interesting. I've always been intrigued by player facing, especially in Dungeons and Dragons. But this actually makes a lot of sense given this entire system. So there you go. Bloodied is, of course, when you go down to a D4. If a NPC rolls their hit dice, if they make a 1, they automatically die. So players do have that little bit of advantage. And of course, there is advantage and disadvantage. Advantage is you would roll a d6 and add that to your ability score. A disadvantage is you roll a d6 and add that to the difficulty. So you're going to add that to your d20 roll. So that'll make it harder to roll underneath. There's all sorts of equipment for your players to acquire. So you have your weapons, and then they actually have a nice chart about drawbacks. So your weapons can have drawbacks. And the armor is the same way, as well as you have the cost and the granted resilience. Decks are basically how you get into the net. If you're not a puppet, you do need a deck. And of course, each of the decks are actually different in how you jack in, which is really interesting. I really do like that little bit of flavor. And then, of course, you have your different types of gear. By the way, I'm trying to keep this book open because this book, I was actually taking a look at it, and at first I thought it was glue bound, but then I found some stitches in there. But I think it's just because there are so few pages here, that it just is having a hard time actually staying closed. So then you get a little brief overview, and I've been very brief about navigating the net. So basically, you're uploading your soul into the internet, is how they explain it. You can't really die in the net, although if you quote unquote die in the net, you basically go into a comatose state for like 1d6 hours. So there is that. And there are different ways of going about the net. So you have different modes that you can access, just kind of the same way in Cyberpunk Red. And they all do different things. This next chapter is chapter 7 or chapter 6, and we're moving pretty fast because there's not really a whole lot of content here. I don't understand why gaining experience is, one, its own chapter, and two, after creating, it's directly after an explanation of the net and gear. Like, really? Can't they just actually put that in after the creating characters? Because they're actually they lead into one another. Because the very last thing that you do as a character is that you pick a goal. You actually pick 3 goals, and that's how you level up. So I don't understand why we have like 2 chapters before we get an explanation on a very brief explanation. This is like 2 paragraphs long on gaining experience. And especially because of the layout of this book, this chapter actually begins in the middle of a page. And that just boggles my mind. I mean, if you had actually included this gaining experience section right after picking goals, that would actually line up this chapter 4 to actually being starting on its own page. Yeah, I don't really have very favorable things to say about that. And then we get advice for admins. So basically, it's being conscious of your players and stuff like that, and managing your character's goals and all of that. It's very brief, and then you start chapter 9, which is the biggest chapter of them all because it's just a bunch of random tables. Like, almost half, or like a good third of this book is just on rollable tables. And I don't know how to feel about that. Because there's very little going here. Like, I get that it's from the Black Hack. And by the way, I have not read through the Black Hack. But I do know that the Black Hack at least has treasures and monsters and stuff like that. This book doesn't even have NPCs or a way to create NPCs or even how to go about that. And so really, you're getting half of a game, in my opinion. You're getting a setting with how to incorporate the themes of the setting and how to play it, but really there's not a whole lot here. And so really, this book, it seems like it's good for a very fast, like a spontaneous, like, hey, we're getting together. What do you guys want to play? All right, I'll pull this out. You guys can choose your class, and now let's play. I got a quick little thing that we can do. This isn't really something that I would plan out and play, per se, because there's so few things going in it for it. Seems like a very interesting system to play in, so I might actually look into the Black Hack on its own, but this is a very niche category. Like, Cyberpunk is it's in a very niche category, and really, do I need an OSR style of playing Cyberpunk? I don't know. That's up to you to decide. I would say I would only recommend this book if you are looking for something quick, or if you have some very new players to role playing. Because then they don't have to worry about, keeping track of ability scores and stuff like that, or their HP. The HP system is, I do like it, and I do like that it's consistent with all players and NPCs, unlike Sentinels, which I had a problem with, that some villains got to use it and some didn't. So this is a weird one for me to review because I don't really care for this. And when a third of your book is actually on rollable tables, like, a lot of the questions that I have going into this book could have been easily explained in a sentence or 2. The layout of this book is rather confusing, especially given that I just did a whole little tidbit on the experience. But I also think that if they had just gone ahead and flipped some of the chapters around, like explaining the intricate mechanics first before getting into the character classes, I think that would have helped a lot. But, man, I don't want to say this book was a nightmare to read, but it was very interesting. Let's just say that. So thank you guys so much for watching. Feel free to leave a comment down below. Perhaps I'm just being an idiot and this is like the greatest book of all time. I don't know about that though. Feel free to give this video a huge thumbs up to support this series and subscribe if you want to see more. I will see you guys in the next video.